Welcome to a new episode, and this opens now here the capturing part. The introduction is so far done, and what I want to do here is to clear some concepts, ideas, or dependencies on reality and virtual reality. What I want to do here is, of course, to check out where we have to think in a different way when we take a practical camera like our DSLR that we use to feed our scene in Cinema 4D, and where the differences are. And I think we can start with lens and filter, body and post. And body means the camera body. And this translates, of course, a little bit differently to Cinema 4D, but the lens is practically the attributes manager and the rendering. The body itself is the render module, and post is perhaps already the filter option in the picture viewer, but also everything that goes then into the pipeline. So there are some similarities, but the differences are always the problem if you try to apply from one world the knowledge to another. There might be a difference, and I want to discuss this here briefly. The first thing that we need to know is, of course, that we deal with completely different light systems. In a practical camera, we go from infrared to ultraviolet, IR to UV. And infrared is very slow compared to ultraviolet, which is considered in frequency very fast compared to IR. And between these 2 points, we have, of course, the main area of the visible light. And we see 3 big areas, R, G, and B. That's our system. And everything between is, for us, most likely white. Of course, it goes warmer, more reddish to the left, more bluish to the right. But however, we adapt to that system. The camera doesn't adapt to this system. We need filters, or we need a different color temperature in our camera to get exactly the light in the way we want. That's different in Cinema 4D. We talk normally about a light vector, and we consider that just as white. If we don't want to have white light, we have to adjust this. We have to introduce a different color to the light if we need that. In reality, we have to live with what we get. And we have different light sources there. And an incandescent light bulb has a different color temperature, maybe here, than maybe an HDMI spotlight, which is more in this area or whitish, whatever. In Cinema 4D, we calculate light based on vectors, or since release 13, we have also the option just to use samples. Okay, now I hear you screaming, that's a simplification. Exactly, that is what I'm doing here. I sketch out exactly what is all about. And I don't go into detail here, because then I would have to talk maybe days about this. That's not the target here. So the next part is, of course, then when we have all that light and we have maybe created here a color temperature for our capturing, and light has not one color temperature, but we say maybe this here is 5600 degree Kelvin. And this is not one point and all the light is then just 5600. It's an area of light. So it's a wide variety, and the average is exactly this. So there can be a little bit fluorescent light in it, incandescent light, indirect light from a wall or from trees, everything. It's a mixture. And we try to find something that gives us an average where we can work with. In Cinema 4D, we can have from the start to the finish just white, because there is no frequency in the light itself. It's a vector or it's a sample, something between as well. Okay, the next part is, of course, it will affect, for the practical camera at least, the lens. Or if we use a filter, which is not very wise in most cases these days, then we can change the light here, of course. Okay, here I said it. The filter is maybe not a good idea. Now I get a lot of complaints, I know. But the truth is, our practical camera here has most likely an CMOS sensor in it. And with that, we have most likely a construction that is called Bayer pattern. And a Bayer pattern is pretty much that we have, when we take the smallest unit, 4 pixels, 2 green, and then we have a red one, and here this one is a blue one. Or it is in a different constellation. But these 4 pixels here finally is pretty much the smallest element in a Bayer pattern. And then when we want to have for each pixel the RGB values, the neighbors gives their values, and it is a big calculation because we get always for each pixel the luminance values, and based on that we get green, or we get the red one here, or we get the blue one, or green again. And so we calculate the light. In the moment we put a filter in front of that, for example a red filter, then only the red pixel will get light, because the red filter filters all green, for example, out, and most likely the blue as well. So we end up with a quarter of our resolution in terms of light. When we do something like this, when we put just a plane with a transparent material in red in front of the Cinema 4D camera, there is no Bayer pattern. When we have 4 pixels, then 4 pixels become each time R, G, and B values, each time. So when we filter something out, then just 2 elements maybe get lost, but the red will be full there for all these 4. And when we have 4 million pixels, then we get 4 million times the red. When we have for a Bayer pattern 4 million elements here, and we filter it with red, we get only 1 million pixels. And that lowers the resolution. Very important to know. If you think you can just filter something to get maybe a better contrast, or to change maybe something that has here to do with the curve. So when the red is maybe too intensive, you use maybe a filter and go then and color correct this back, and no way. This is nothing typical, I know that, but to illustrate the problems and the differences between these two systems, we have to know that we get from the practical camera these days most likely a calculation from R, G, and B and G. And from cinema we get full values for each pixels. Very important. Okay, the next point is, of course, when we talk about these frequencies here, we know very well that we have here a lens. And when we send a theoretical ray through it, it will be refracted, but not straight. It will go extremely set in this way. You remember the Pink Floyd cover with the prism? And then you have here that rainbow between? Exactly, that's the point. The faster the frequency is, the more it will be refracted, which finally leads to a chromatic aberration. And exactly this gives that lilac or greenish fringing on the end. That can happen when you have a very small sensor with small cameras. And the lens is maybe very good, but based on the small lens, we need a huge refraction to feed this small sensor. And then we get this effect very, very magnified on the end. It happens also with larger sensors, so there is no limit. And based on that, the engineers who create lenses put another lens in front of that to compensate for that. And so we get finally a package of 14, 15, 16 lenses in 6 or 9 groups, whatever, to get on the end exactly what we had in reality. All of that is not needed in Cinema 4D. We have in Cinema 4D just an icon for all these calculations, and we don't need a real camera. It's just an icon that gives us the idea where the camera is. Of course, we can introduce that we have maybe a sensor inside, and that means only that we talk about the size of the sensor, which gives finally a lot of dependencies when we talk about depth of field or motion blur, or also other parts of the camera. But mainly important is the point where we have the camera, the X and Y and Z value here. And that's the whole point here for the camera. If we want to have something, then we need to simulate this. And that's maybe the big point always in Cinema 4D. We talk about simulation, so we have options. We don't need to follow reality, but we can. And we can improve it. And we can even make it worse than reality. So we have already lens distortion in it, and we have other things in release 13 or 14 already in it. And with the practical one, we have to deal with all of these lens packages that finally gives, based on the field of view and the construction, more or less a lens distortion. And there's more, of course, to it. And the simplest way to say the biggest problem that we have with practical cameras is, of course, that we have in the middle of the picture maybe a very hot spot for sharpness. And then the lens is a little bit weak on the side. And when you have a full frame camera, you know that maybe more than with a smaller sensor sized camera. In Cinema 4D, when we want to mark the sharp area of the picture, then we just can do this. It's all over the place. If we want to have it blurry, we need to introduce this. With the lens, we have dependencies in it. The next part is, of course, depth of field and motion blur. I will talk about this in the third main part of this course, because we have to deal with these things if they are in a picture or if they are not, whatever. And I will talk about this more in detail, of course. But depth of field is a result of a very specific constellation inside of the lens. It has to do with the aperture, with the point of confusion, and the lens itself, the distance, the frame size of the sensor, and so on. In Cinema 4D, again, we have to simulate this. As well, motion blur, we have to simulate this. If we don't check this on, we have no motion blur. We have always a super sharp image, and here in the practical camera, we have to fight against it. When we don't want to have a depth of field effect in it, that means no shallow depth of field with a bokeh in the background or the blurry part in the foreground, then we have to get the aperture very small. And there's, of course, also a downside. Normally, when you read the bigger the f-stop number, which is always a fraction of 1, f22 means that we have a very small one and the longest or the largest depth of field. But we have also the most blurry effect over the whole distance, from the first point where we see something in the lens to the last point. The performance of the whole lens gets really low. I would always say between 4 and f8 is the sweet spot of every lens. That might be more on 4, that might be more on 8, and beyond or above this. You have to know that for your lens, of course. In Cinema 4D, if I don't give anything for depth of field into the mix, when I don't simulate it, I don't have to fight it because it's not there. But lenses are tricky in that. So just to stop down a lens to 22 means I get a less sharp image. And to use then sharpening in Photoshop or something like that is, of course, a big no, because sharpening just introduces on the edges a little bit dark, a little bit bright, and when we color correct this, we increase or decrease this, and it mixes all of that into the picture. And especially when we have this as texture in the picture and we render it, it can go very, very bad into the rendering. That's nothing that I would suggest. We talk about this, of course, in the practical part, in the capture part. And here, normally I would say, if you have a little bit blur in the picture, have a look to deconvolution effects, where the camera has produced a problem and then the software tries to figure out what it is and tries to work against it. it's a complicated process. It's not cheap to have, but it's maybe sometimes worth the trouble. Anyway, just to mention this. So if you want to check this out, I have written this down here. And the next part, and you see we go here slowly but certainly down to the body already. Sensor was discussed here already, and it's always a mixture. There's always some kind of interaction, of course, from the lens to the body and then to the post. And the truth is, we have to deal here with some big differences. In the moment, and as said here above, and I shorten this, of course, when we talk about ISO, that means the sensitivity of the sensor. When I said we don't have to really care about this in Cinema 4D, then I had something in mind. And if you have listened to some of my stuff already, then you know I'm a big fan of 32-bit float per channel. And that means whatever you give here in Cinema 4D, you can even crank up light sources to an extreme value and render the whole scene. It will just capture these values as long as you save this in this format. If you crank up light sources like crazy and save this in 8-bit, like in a JPEG or so, it will be clipped. It will be just white and there's no way back. With 32-bit, there is normally certainly a way back to it. When we have a practical camera and the light source is huge and we haven't set up the camera in the way that it can capture this, that means the aperture and the time that the light reaches to the sensor, then we have maybe to deal with clipped values. That means it goes over the top and then we lose this information. So based on the ISO that we have chosen in conjunction with the value that the light has finally, we get maybe an image that is perfect in the practical camera, or we get something that is clipped. On the other hand, we have, when we have too less light on the floor and the plaques, most likely just noise. And noise is something that is not really useful when we want to do camera mapping or camera projection. This is a big thing in post because we have to fight this. In the moment we leave that on, it will be very ugly. And in Cinema 4D, if we want to have noise, that's maybe a question how we introduce this, or finally we would have to fight to get it in because there is no noise normally based on too less light. Anything that has noise in Cinema 4D is maybe based on very sharp textures or similar things, but never based on too less light in terms of that a sensor would have no idea what to do because the photons that reach to the sensor are too less. We might run into GI or some simulation where we have to deal with noise, where the variety of rays or the amount of rays that get shot into the space is similar. And then we have a similar problem, but with pure ray tracing, for example, and that is most likely what we want to do with camera projection. We don't have to deal with that. And we don't want to have noise on our images for that. So this is just a small little introduction to the whole theme. Very rough, and I admit I have left out many details in it. There's certainly more to that theme. And of course, one big thing, and that has nothing to do here with the whole part, it is more on a general rule, and I want to give you that in an extra note. One thing that I want to mention here is when we take an image with our camera, with the practical camera, there is a sensor inside. This sensor has a very specific resolution in width and in height, or width and tall, whatever you like, and this is normally expressed in megapixels. And the resolution starts exactly here. We can shoot whatever we like. If we take just a small little stone or something like this and we shoot it, we can shoot a small little tiny spot from that stone and we stick with our resolution. The stone itself has no real resolution. We can go to the atoms finally to get maybe a stop in resolution. Sloppily said, of course, there's more. But what I want to express is, of course, reality has normally no resolution problems. We can go far away or very close to pretty much anything, to a leaf from a tree or something like that, and we get our resolution in the camera. So that's very, very important to understand. And it is dependent on the camera and how we use the camera, what kind of resolution we get finally into our system here with the storage. In Cinema 4D, our world here, if we create in stone, we put a texture on it or a shader, for example. And this texture has a resolution. The shader normally has no resolution, it's a mathematical description, but in case of a texture, we can go close to that object, but with the texture we see after a while pixels. So there is a limit. But the beauty of the camera in Cinema 4D, when we take here the sensor inside, exactly like with the real camera, so when we compare this to each other, we can set up any X number here for both, for width and height, to get finally an image. Of course, there is a limit always. It's not infinite. But the truth is, with a practical camera, we have a maximum limit with our sensor. In Cinema 4D, we don't have, but we have maybe more a limit on our objects. Of course, I mentioned the shader. When we have a good shader that has a mathematical description, we have maybe no limit inside of that. So there is a big difference in both. One goes in this direction, so to say, and one goes in the other direction. Then, when we finally arrive in cinema, and we have decided which size this has finally, then we have to decide, when I say this is my final image that I want to render, how big this stone, where I have taken the texture from, will be in the picture, if it is very small or very big, or if I see only a small fraction of that. This gives me finally then an idea how much resolution I need in the first place. And it's not given that you can say we have a huge texture from that stone and it will always be enough, or it could be a tree, a bark, or whatever. It's always the relation how close cinema goes with the camera to this object and the field of view, of course. When I go very close to an object, but I have a large field of view, the resolution for that object needs not to be that high. For that we have normally a color grid. That's just a texture with, looks like a checkerboard, but has different colors, and each color has maybe a number on it. And we wrap this around, and each of these squares should have maybe a certain amount of pixels in it. So we can say always when we see a square on that object in the camera finally, then we know this is maybe here 100 or 200 pixels wide. And then we can say exactly, okay, we need here 3000 pixels. And so when this is here only 100, then that will show pixelation. That's not sufficient. And with camera projection, we run maybe even faster into that. There's one rule of thumb. Any pixel that we see in the final render should have in texture at least a 1.5 higher resolution than the final is. So why is that 1.5? When I have here 1 pixel, and let's say the pixel is of course 1 unit by 1 unit, and I want to have anything behind this, and objects move, camera moves, and all of that. So worst case happened, if I think I can get away with 1 by 1 pixel, then I have maybe 1 pixel here and 1 pixel works in this way. And then this little area here moves into the next pixel. I have from the other pixel already something into it. And so the idea is that I take the diagonal here, and the diagonal is 1 to the power of 2 plus 1 to the power of 2, Pythagoras. That means that equals 1 plus 1 is 2. And so I take the square root out of 2, which equals 1.414, and it goes a little bit longer. And that is roughly 1.5. And then I can say I get here now exactly 1 pixel inside of that. And when I take here just this value in the middle of the pixel, I get a very stable value, and so on. And then I have here 1 pixel between these, and the next full pixel is then inside, idleized. It's most likely that we should have a bigger value than 1.5. Anything higher in resolution is of course an advantage, especially when the camera goes closer to the texture. It's pretty fast pixelated in the picture. Okay, this pretty much sums it up. We could talk about camera response curve. I have done this in the HDRI series, so I don't want to go there again. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on, but this is pretty much in a nutshell where we have the biggest differences. And when we shoot for camera projection, we have to acknowledge that there's a big difference. And we go into the practical part, capturing, with all these problems in detail. And then I make a list where to have an eye on and how to shoot this. See you in the next part.